Pupils with Impairment this afternoon. I think for those of you that have been to Girlington, we have got a local authority-led resource provision for deaf pupils, which cater for up to 20 pupils. It's very much part of our school. So I'm going to talk to you about how to support those pupils if they're in your setting. I tend not to, with this session, to go into breakout rooms because there's quite a bit of content to get through, but that's not to say that you can't jump in and ask a question, and we can do some questions at the end if anybody has got anything they want to ask, so please feel free. So in terms of the aims for this afternoon, it's to understand how to support deaf and hearing impaired pupils in the classroom, and it's to consider the different modes of communication that those pupils might use. And there's a range of different communication methods that people who are deaf and hearing impaired might use. So like it says there, British Sign Language, sign supported English, lip patterns and non-verbal communication. There's two links on there for further information if you want to find out a little bit more. In terms of the deaf community, it's a very strong community. There's a lot of sort of politics attached to it in terms of what they believe and how they want to be viewed and seen. We have a mixture in school. So some families want children who are deaf to not use BSL at all. Some families want BSL and no oral language. So it's really important that we don't assume how people want to be communicated with, whether they're deaf or hearing impaired. We've recently moved as well to the resource provision saying it's the resource provision for deaf pupils rather than deaf and hearing impaired, because that's something that's come to light from the deaf community. So that's where we're up to with that. So in terms of here in Bradford, we're called, it's called a resource provision, previously known as ARC, Area Resource Centre, and I know in different authorities they're also known as different things as well. In Bradford, there are 3 resource provisions for deaf pupils. So there's Girlington Primary, there is Swain House, which is also primary, and then there is Hanson, that is secondary. And they also, as Hanson Secondary, do vision impairment as well. Like I say, we have got a 20-place resource provision. Currently got 19 children in the resource provision. To generally get a place in a resource provision as opposed to being part of a mainstream class, your hearing loss tends to be severe or profound. We do have the odd child in our resource provision whose hearing loss is moderate. They tend to be children whose deafness maybe hasn't been identified when they were younger, maybe because they're Eastern European and they've come to the country and they've not had access to the same healthcare systems. Sometimes it's children who've got other additional needs as well that might tip them into the range of getting a place in a resource provision. But more often than not, their hearing loss is profound or severe. So we've got a range of pupils in terms of what they use. Some use cochlear implants, some children use hearing aids. And like I said at the beginning, we all the children in our resource provision use different modes of communication. So some children use exclusively British Sign Language, some children use sign-assisted English, and some use a mixture of both and or spoken language as well. Like it says there, children who have been diagnosed late, and they're often children who have come to Britain from another country, have been diagnosed late, so it's much harder for them to pick up any amplification because obviously their cochlear and their brain has got used to, you know, not hearing any sounds, whereas children who are identified at birth or really early on have had the opportunities to have cochlear implants if parents want them, or hearing aids, you know, been using those so that they have being able to sort of pick up some sounds. We're going to look at how we hear sounds as we move through these slides. The other difficulty that we have here, and it's the same in the other resource provisions in Bradford, is for us, the majority of our children in our resource provision now also don't have English as a home language. And we've moved away. So when we first got our resource provision, our school, it was because there was a really high incidence of deafness in the local community. And parents were often deaf, so it was a hereditary thing, and they were BSL learners. What we're finding now is there are a mixture of parents who don't have English as a first language, often Slovakian Roma, Urdu, Punjabi, don't use English, and also are not necessarily deaf themselves, so don't have BSL. So in terms of children picking up a level of communication, there is nobody at home that is they're able to communicate with, because they're either BSL learners, they're sign supported English learners, or they're English speakers, and home language is something different. So it's a really, really complex mix in terms of communication. So in terms of hearing loss, you've got the diagram of the inner ear there, and it's exactly what it says there. So hearing loss can be caused by lots of different things. So blockages in your ear from sort of glue ear, which is temporary. Often young children who have glue ears sometimes have grommets put in. Some of those, some of you might have had that when you were younger. Or like it says there, something's caused it through damage, genetic abnormalities, illness or injury, which is usually permanent. And it can happen into different parts of the ears, which then obviously result in different degrees of deafness. So in terms of degrees of deafness, like I said, in Bradford, to access a place in resource provision, you have to be in the severe to profound level of hearing loss. Children who fall in the first three categories, especially the mild to moderate, those children would be part of a mainstream class and may have access to somebody from the outreach team, the peri team, who come in and check that those children are getting the right provision within a mainstream classroom. So they still could be cochlear implanted, they still could be hearing aid users, but their hearing loss isn't as great as the children down here. And we're going to have a look at what that means in terms of decibels so that you've got a clearer understanding of that. So in terms of understanding sounds, you can see here on an audiogram that this is where both ears, so the left being the blue and the red being the right ear, they have the same level of hearing loss. So in terms of low sounds, this audiogram for this child, they will be able to hear some of the low sounds when the situation is relatively quiet, but they won't be able to hear more high-pitched sounds unless they are extremely loud. So here is what a typical audiogram looks like in terms of the different types of sounds. So you've got your range of hearing loss down this side, and that's compared to what we talked about on the other slide in terms of the decibels. So this banana here is your typical hearing range for the majority of people. So we can hear these consonants and vowel sounds, from normal hearing in terms of the pitch of normal hearing. We'll be able to hear the rustling of leaves, we'll be able to hear whispering, we'll be able to hear that tap dripping in the corner and that clock ticking. The further you move down the scale in terms of your level of deafness, it then obviously takes out that you won't be able to hear this. So if you are deaf and you have a profound hearing loss, you may be able to hear some of these sounds down at the bottom, such as a siren or an aeroplane, if you have some adaptation, such as a cochlear implant or a hearing aid, but you won't be able to hear up this end. So, you know, when you have got a deaf child in your class, it's really important that you have a really good understanding of their level of deafness. Is it in both ears? Is it just in one ear? Is one more profound than the other? Because that has an impact on your classroom practice. Because if their hearing loss is more severe in one ear than the other, then that will help you to think about their positioning in the classroom, where they sit, you know, what they're next to, what sort of outside influences might be impacting that, you know, if they are near the door, if they're near the window, if they're near that child that can't sit still and fidgets, all those things that might have an impact on their well-being as well as their ability to access learning in the classroom. So like I said, there are two main different types of adaptations or resources, that equipment that deaf people will use, and those are hearing aids and cochlear implants. And it does depend on the type and the degree of deafness, depending on what type of technology you will be offered. And it is very much parental choice. Some parents are real advocates of cochlear implants, which work best when they are used from birth, or, you know, not long after that, because it's about, you know, the signal from your brain through your cochlea, your brain getting used to those sounds so that they can start identifying them. The later that you are cochlear implanted, the less successful it will be for you to be able to hear sounds. Whereas hearing aids, you know, you're more likely to get those if your hearing loss is moderate or less than that. And obviously, some people might be prescribed hearing aids as they go through life. If you think about, you know, people, you know, elderly people who have got a little bit of deafness, it will be a hearing aid that they will be prescribed. So in terms of a hearing aid, that's what the hearing aid looks like. And you can see from this diagram here, and you will have all come across them, this is the bit that goes into your ear, and then you've got your microphone here and the amplifier, and then the battery that sits behind your ear. You know, technology has really moved a lot recently, and these are really quite tiny now. You can't often see them in people's ears. You know, they make them in different colour plastics and things now, which is brilliant. Obviously, from a primary school point of view, that could be quite tricky because they're tiny, and children don't like wearing them, particularly when they first get them. They want to take them out. They can get lost quite easily. On some of the hearing aids, the battery comes off, so sometimes children lose those batteries, and they are those little silver circular ones. So, you know, we're occasionally hunting around school for somebody whose battery is missing, which can be quite tricky. Because obviously for little people, if you pick up something shiny and silver, it's also quite inviting. But, you know, children who wear hearing aids, it's about getting them independent at using them. So part of the programme for children in our resource provision is that they will become independent at knowing when their battery needs changing, knowing, because obviously it'll start beeping, knowing how to put it in, knowing how to clean it, because as you can imagine, they get wax in them. So knowing how to look after them, where to put them at home when they take them out at bedtime, because obviously they're a really expensive piece of equipment and they really need looking after. Here is the audiogram of somebody who is deaf, who is a moderate hearing loss, who would wear a hearing aid. So you can see that this, once they've got their hearing aid in, this will be the range of sounds that they will now be able to hear within here. If it is really quiet, we might be able to pick up some of the ones on either side of the audiogram. And then in terms of a cochlear implant, obviously, initially that's quite invasive because it's an operation, because the implant is put below the surface of the skin, you know, at the back of your head. which is sometimes where parents don't want that, because when you've got a tiny youngster, that can be quite traumatic. But you can see how it works there. So we've got the implant here that is put under the skin, and then here you've got the electrode contact that then feeds into the cochlea, which then helps the cochlea to pick up sound. The coil here is obviously on the outside of your head, and that sticks to the implant like using a magnet. So they are in all the time. Sometimes they become loose. You know, you sometimes see children with them hanging down here because we just knock them. The other thing to consider when you've got children who are wearing hearing aids or cochlear implants is if they're also if they also wear glasses. Not only do they have to get used to wearing a hearing aid or getting used to their cochlea, which, you know, it's picking up sounds that they've not heard before, plus it's uncomfortable. If you're then putting a pair of glasses on top of that and over your ear, that's tricky. So there's a lot of working with children in terms of their social, emotional, mental needs, as well as their independence if they, you know, if they're using both, because they will refuse. And, you know, for a lot of our children, a lot of our parents, sometimes they find it easier to give in, you know, and say, well, don't wear it because it's upsetting them, because it's hurting. And then the less you wear it, the more scary the sounds are. Whereas once you've got used to wearing it, then it becomes second nature, and they want to wear it, and they've got used to the discomfort. You can get adaptive glasses for children who need to wear them all the time, so that it's a bit more comfortable, the arms of the glasses over their ears. But the same here in terms of if you are cochlear implanted, the sounds that you would be able to hear within the range when you've got a cochlear implant, because like it says there, cochlear implants replicate sounds, whereas hearing aids amplify sounds. So there's a slight difference there. So, like it says there, if you are a hearing aid or cochlear implant wearer, you don't hear sounds the same as a hearing person. So I'm going to see if I can get our video to work. No, last time I did this, it didn't. We had to try and watch it another time. Really sorry, it doesn't look like it is going to work. What that clip there is it's a really short clip, but what it does is it lets you experience what it will be like if you were a cochlear implant or hearing aid user, what the sounds and the environment will sound like, because it is very different to what we are now hearing. It's much more muffled and it's not very clear. And I think if you have got any deaf or hearing impaired children in your setting, it would be really worth listening to that, because if you think in a busy classroom of 30 children, all that background noise that you can have when they're on shared tasks, all the things that happen down the corridor that can interfere with noise, and then if you listen to that video, what they can actually hear, that will help you to be really mindful of how you work in your classrooms. So in terms of communicating with a deaf person, there's various ways to make it easier for them to use their hearing technology. So what we have at Girlington and also Swain House and Hanson have is we have hearing aids, radio aids, sorry. So all our classrooms have sound field systems. So I think for most of you who have been here, when we've looked around, all classrooms have 4 speakers in each classroom. So that's the sound system. And if you are teaching and you've got deaf children in your classroom, you put the radio aid on round your neck. and the children who've got the hearing aids or the cochlear implants tune into the hearing aid. It's like a microphone around your neck, and it will help them to pick up the sounds equally rather than them being projected and then being at the back of the class and only hearing the quiet or the loud ones. But like it says there, if there's an awful lot of background noise, it makes it really difficult to hear one voice above the others. So from classroom practice, it's about, you know, making sure that we don't have low-level behaviours and we don't have low-level noise, particularly when we're doing class input, and that we train our children. You know, if you're thinking about, you know, your behaviour management, we're training our children to not talk over each other and to be respectful and mindful, you know, in terms of talk rules when we're speaking in groups and sharing our ideas, so that the children who have hearing loss have equal access, quite rightly, to the learning and the provision. The radio aids look different in different settings. When I first started teaching, it was more like, I used to call it a Britney Spears microphone that goes around your head and comes around. These are the ones that we've got now, but I know in different settings they look differently. What we also have, because we've got the resource provision, is our upper key stage 2 part of our building is acoustically treated. So the classrooms and the group rooms that the resource provision children use are acoustically treated. So when the windows are shut and the doors are shut, it really, really deadens the sound, which obviously then goes a long way to sort of helping block out the background noise that might be going on in the corridor or the classroom next door. So in terms of communicating with deaf people, obviously we know communication is a two-way process. It's not only what we say or sign, but it's all those other things. You know, when we've talked about communication before, the biggest part of communication is our facial expressions and our body language, and that's even more important when we're communicating with deaf people. So it's making sure that we have really good eye contact so that they absolutely know that you are communicating with them, you know, getting down to their level, looking at them, that sometimes you use slightly more exaggerated gesture and facial expressions, that you do use the appropriate tone of voice, because if you use a loud voice, that will just sound like an awful screech, a bit like fingers down a blackboard to somebody who's got their hearing aid or their cochlear implant in. So making sure that you're not shouting or screeching, and that we really think about our body language, because if we are not looking like we are really enthusiastic, or, you know, if we're reprimanding, that we are looking like we are cross, those subtle things will absolutely get misinterpreted for a deaf student. So it's really thinking about those kinds of things. And, you know, for those of you that sometimes have subtitles on when you're watching the telly, and or if you've got, you know, sometimes on some programs the deaf signer is in the corner, that's why their facial expressions are often quite exaggerated, because it's really, really about communicating meaning. Because if you think about the ambiguity and the subtlety of language, if you don't communicate that correctly, it can absolutely be misinterpreted. Because if you are a BSL user as well, BSL, obviously the order of BSL is not the same order as written English and spoken English language. We don't, as BSL users, they don't have the little words like and, it, but, etc. But also there aren't signs for everything. So part of a sign for some words will be the same sign for another word, but it's how you present it in terms of your facial expressions and your body language. So you've got to really be clear that you're giving the absolute right message. Otherwise, that can lead to a whole host of problems. So like it says there, deaf people can communicate in many different ways. Some use sign language or finger spelling. Some children, and definitely some deaf adults, are really, really good at lip reading, which is why it's also important that you are giving eye contact and you are facing the person that you are talking to, because it's all of those things together. It's not just looking at the signs, it's looking at your lip patterns, obviously facial expressions and gestures. In terms of written language, texts, letters, emails. But like I say, if your first language is BSL and that's your sort of history and your community, then you sometimes can find written language difficult because it is in a completely different order. It's just the same as learning any other language. It's about knowing the order and knowing how it comes. And then some children use sign supported English, which, like it says there, it's the same signs from BSL, but they are in English word order. So those are the children whose families want them to be oral, or they have got a level of language themselves as well, often use SSE. Some signs, I sometimes get asked about Makaton. Some signs are similar or the same in Makaton and BSL. We tend to use BSL here, even with our children who are pre-verbal or have got limited language, unless we feel that Makaton is more accessible to them. But that's a conversation with parents and things. But like it says there, the preferred mode of communication depends on hearing loss. And people with moderate hearing loss tend to use speech as well as signs and gestures, whereas severe or profound, it would be relying on lip patterns and sign language. So now, because I can't get my clips to work, this is a comedy sketch, this one, but it just makes it really clear about how lip reading is really important, but what the limitations are to it. So like it says there, having a hearing loss makes speech sounds quiet and distorted or both. Lip reading is an invaluable skill as it helps you receive the message. But it can also help improve self-confidence. But there are limitations to it because not all words are easily lip read, are they? You would really have to enunciate with your mouth if you are wanting somebody to clearly understand what you are communicating. So if you are just talking like I'm speaking now, I'm not going to be moving my lips as much as I would if I was communicating with one of our deaf adults or deaf children. And the same if you talk fast or you mumble or you're writing on the blackboard. Sounding like I'm in the 1980s, you're writing on your whiteboard and you've got your back to the class. There's no way they're going to pick up on any of those subtleties. So it's about making sure that all those things are really, really clear so that it's really, really accessible to everybody. One of the biggest things we come across is helping other children in the class to understand how to communicate with their peers so that we're all included, because what we find, especially because we've got a resource provision, and for us, the majority of our children in our resource provision are taught for core subjects outside of the classroom for the morning by a specialist teacher of the deaf and specialist support workers. And then they are in the classroom for the foundation subjects in the afternoon, but obviously everything's adapted. But because they are very much part of their little group and their little community, then once we go out into less structured times and social time, they tend to want to play with the friends that they're with all the time, which is their deaf peers. So we work really hard at making sure that both the hearing and the deaf children integrate with each other because we are one big school. But that obviously is about teaching them rules and ways to communicate. So if you're thinking about how you might communicate with deaf children, it is about speaking clearly and naturally, making sure that your mouth is visible, like we've said, so that children can lip read. If you want to get a deaf child or deaf adult's attention, it's important that you do some of those things there. So it might be just literally giving a little wave, like, want your attention. You might knock on the table because obviously you can pick up the vibrations through that, or you might tap them lightly on the shoulder. This is the one that we find that we have to train our children to do, because they want to go over and tap the friend because they want to talk to them. And you can think, if you are profoundly deaf and you are in that world and somebody taps you a little bit stronger than lightly, it will make you jump. And you know, so it's about how we do that, and we tap lightly and we make sure we come round into their space so that they know it's non-threatening. Facing them, getting down to their level, making eye contact. When you are in the classroom, or you know, whole class, groups, and when one-to-one, it's making it really clear what the topic of conversation is and when it's changed. So you think about social times, you know, you're talking about, you know, what they did at the weekend or whatever, and then somebody starts talking about a favourite hobby, and then you start talking about the ins and outs of that. That won't be picked up, so you have to signal talking about this now so that you can bring them in. Use whole sentences so that the deaf children can pick up clues about what's being said. So that's the difference between BSL, which has got, you know, words missing, but also that we don't just, you know, do clip sentences because we're speaking quickly, that we do whole sentences, so that it gives them the opportunity to really pick up on what the conversation is about. Like it says there, group conversations can be difficult. So that's about your talk rules and making sure that they can be involved all together. And then consider repeating and rephrasing instructions, possibly using some visuals, possibly writing things down. But like always, it's about knowing your children, isn't it? And knowing what works for them. What not to do: don't speak too slowly or shout. They won't hear you. If they're profoundly deaf, they won't hear you. So there is no point doing it, which I know sounds really obvious, but I still see sometimes people in school here who, you know, we've had deaf provision in our school for over 20 years. Sometimes they still speak in a louder voice. And I don't know whether it's because when you are trying to articulate and be really clear with your mouth patterns, it kind of encourages you to speak louder because you are being clearer, but there is absolutely no need to do that, so don't do that. Don't move your head or walk around while you're talking, because speech movements can be easily missed and then you'll misinterpret the conversation. Consider background noise, because like I said, if you're a hearing aid user, it amplifies all of the noises. So there's nothing worse than it being grass cutting day or the class next door doing music when you're trying to have a session, you know, in your class with your deaf and hearing impaired children. Don't cover your mouth or slouch, you know, put your hand on it, all those kind of things. But also teaching other children about these kind of things, because this is what they need to be able to do to include. Don't stand with your back towards the window, because that can create a shadow on your face, which makes it harder to lip read. And that's the same about positioning in the classroom. Think about where you sit your deaf children. Think about what light is coming in from the window, because, and that might be different for different times of the day, you know. So thinking about, you know, where they sit in front of the whiteboard, where your lights, natural lights coming in from, where your electric lights coming in from, what might be happening in terms of outside, if them got a greater hearing loss in one ear. So really thinking about the positioning, and also thinking about the positioning for children who do have support in the classroom, whether it's somebody who's doing BSL or a teaching assistant or a special assistant, where you sit them. Because for our children who use BSL, when they're in the mainstream classrooms, you are still the teacher. They are listening to your learning, or they are attending to your learning. The role of the person that's working with them is to support them in the way that if they're a BSL learner, they're interpreting that. And it's a really fine line between, obviously they've got to look at the BSL to understand the conversation, but they also need to be able to see the screens, because that's what you're talking about. And that is a skill that you just have to practice when you've got BSL interpreters in your classroom. And then when you're turning to write on the whiteboard, don't talk at the same time. And I know those things sound really obvious, but you will all know that those are things that we all do naturally, because that's how we teach. So it goes back to being really mindful and really doing things on purpose, so that everybody's included. In terms of other things at our school, so all the children who are in the resource provision have 2 extra lessons to the mainstream children. So they have BSL once a week, that's taught by our deaf instructor. So she's profoundly deaf herself. She obviously gets access to work. So she has a hearing person who signs for her, and then she teaches our children BSL. So all the children have a BSL lesson because that's their first language for the majority of them a week. They also have a deaf studies lesson, and that is about them identifying as a deaf child and being part of the deaf community and what being deaf means to them, so that they can self-advocate, so that they know their place in the world, so that they are less vulnerable. Because if you think, you know, for them, the online world, for example, is really invaluable to them. You know, that's your opportunity to be with your friends and communicate with your friends. But in terms of being safe online, that's a huge thing for all children, isn't it, in primary and secondary? But for the deaf community, that can lead them to be even more vulnerable, to being susceptible to things that we wouldn't want to happen to them, because they don't understand the subtleties of things. You know, if you're thinking about online grooming and safety things like that. So it's really important that they really understand what it means to be deaf and how to keep themselves safe, how to communicate with their peers, how to communicate with the hearing world, so that they can become independent adults and learners as they get you know, further on in their education life and out into the big wide world. We also do signing choir for our deaf children, which is lovely. So that happens once a week, where they practice signing to songs and singing. Music's really important for deaf children. All our deaf children have brass lessons as well, and they are really quite good at it. They've been doing it for a long time, because it's about the vibrations and being able to feel those. And you know, when you've got one sense missing or that's not the same as the other senses, then obviously the rest of your senses are heightened, aren't they? So for them, music is really important because it helps them to really get used to vibrations and feeling things and being able to have success at lots of different things, as well as the academic side of things. So I hope that has been helpful. I hope that it's covered what we set out to cover this afternoon. I'm really sorry that the clips weren't working, but I know this will either be on Mosaic or it'll be somewhere for you to be saved. So please, if you get the opportunity, have a look at those 2 clips, because I do think they're really helpful. You know, the 2 clips are on there, and one of them, like I said, is a comedy sketch, but we do use some of this training that I've done with you today with our staff every year as a reminder. I think it's really important. Has anybody got any questions? Please just shout out or whatever if you have.